After a good night's rest under the stars, I woke up to a chilly morning. To warm up and get the day started, I built a fire and brewed some fresh coffee. This was one of the luxuries of having electric hookups at our campsite. We didn't have to make coffee the old-fashioned way. I started to ponder where I wanted the next location of paint to be at, and I remembered a place we toured the following day. I loaded up the car and drove to the back of the state park. Through the lush forest of pine trees, this is where the primitive campsites are. Many state parks provide primitive camping for those who enjoy secluded areas. The road was narrow where I wanted to set up, so I parked at the end of the trail and hauled the painting supplies to the spot. I learned I really need to lighten my load when I go out painting. I pulled out my portable watercolor tray and it was time to get started. Today is day 2 of painting. The location that I picked today is a little bit farther out in the campground of Colt Creek State Park, and it's in the primitive camping part of it. And I like this area because the sun is shining down into the trees, creating some shadows around, but it also has the buildings and the rocks in the background to add a little bit more subject matter to it. For today's painting, I'm gonna do watercolor compared to yesterday doing acrylic, just to kind of see the difference of how the end subject turns out. So let's see what happens. To get started, I started sketching out the scene lightly on the paper. I first figured out where the horizon line was, then drew in the top of the tree line and the outline of the building in the distance. My favorite part about this location was the dirt road leading to it. I like how it turns and the grassy patch in the middle. It draws the viewer's eyes back from the foreground to the background. I believe this road will play a part in the main character of this painting. I wonder how many people have traveled down this road and how many stories that it could tell. The dirt road almost gives it an old-timely feel, going back to the days before paved roads. One of my favorite things about painting out here is not only the sights but also the sounds. I hear birds back in the back, and I don't know if you can hear it or not, but there's a cow mooing or making some kind of sounds. Sounds like they're playing games or something back there. So it's a little bit nice to be out here in the fresh air, listen to the nature, the insects. Luckily the insects aren't getting me today, and just being away from the screens and the sounds of restaurants and cars and the everyday city life while out here painting. The artist Claude Monet once said, "My wish is to stay always like this, living quietly in the corner of nature." There is a tranquility about being outside that I hope all get to experience. Back to the painting, the sketch was done and it was time to wet the paper. I like to initially wet the entire paper, and in this case, an 11 by 15 piece of cold pressed watercolor paper. This allows the pigment to freely move around and blend with one another during the initial wash. I first started at the top, the background, and started laying in the first wash for the sky using a cerulean blue. Afterwards, I moved to the tree line in the distance using my go-to for greens, hooker's green. Since the building is white, I try not to get any paint flowing through it. I'm trying to move quick to allow pigment to hit the paper before it dries. After my greens, I move towards the earth tones of the yellow ochre and raw umber to fill in the initial wash of the ground. I don't mind if the greens and yellows mix. Most of this will be covered up with another layer of color. The key now is just to get the white of the paper covered. I move back to the sky to add in a few more values of blue, just to give an indication of the clouds that are in the sky. Since clouds are fluffy and not hard-edged, I sometimes rinse my brush and blend in the new value with just a damp brush. I start to work more on the tree line using the hooker's green, but this time using more pigment on my brush. I want a hard edge at the top of the trees, so I make sure that the paper is mostly dry. I'm not worried about the individual tree shapes, just the contour line of the organic shape that forms from all the tops of the trees and where they all touch the ground. From a distance, you don't see the individual trees, just values of color. While the paper is still wet, I add in some cadmium yellow to indicate where light could be hitting the trees. I just dab it in so that the pigment spreads around. Also add in some Indian red to give the area some more character. The key to being an artist is learning to see, and if you can look at an area, you'll notice a multitude of color from where light bounces around, or in this case, our eyes pick up colors from trees farther back. One of the things I did forget to do before I started this painting was actually tape this side down so it doesn't start to curl. So as you can see, as the water hits it, it starts to curl up. So I want to try and prevent that from happening. I put the tape just a little bit in because I know eventually we're going to put a mat on this. So we're not even going to see to the very edge of it with the finished product. So hopefully the paper's not too wet to where the tape doesn't stick. And voila, no more curling. The problem is I have old masking tape, so it never wants to come out right. Alright, now that we got her all taped up to where it's going to stop the buckling, I'm going to take a drink of water because it is starting to get a little warm this time of the day. It got cold last night during the nighttime because the cold front came in, but now it's starting to warm up again, so sunny days. Now that the tree area was done, it was time to focus on the middle and foreground, the ground and the road. I'm using my combination of yellow ochre and raw umbers. As I'm laying in the color, I'm not just doing a flat wash of color. I want to use the bumps of the paper and the drying parts of the paper to create areas of texture. This will show that the ground is not flat, but instead has an uneven surface as any ground does. To show depth within this landscape, I'm trying to stay mindful of my value scale. The colors will be more vibrant and a higher contrast as it moves closer to us. The further off distance calls for lighter value and less vibrant color. I start to lay down the greens for the grassy area on top of the old yellow ochre wash. My go-to brush is usually this number 6 round detail brush. It allows me to soak up the paint and pigment, and it holds enough to complete different size areas. The fine tip it comes to allows me to curve in and out of different types of lines. Just like in the trees, I drop in different spots of raw umbers and Indian reds because the ground is not all one flat color. Due to the different weeds, grasses, and dirt mounds, the ground is bursting with a multitude of colors. Let's test out your artistic eye. When you look at this area of green, how many different colors do you see? Make sure to include all the variety of values of color you see too. Landscape artist and painting teacher David Dunlap tells his students to stop identifying objects, but instead see scenes as a collection of lines, shadows, shapes, and contours. And almost instantly, his students' sketchbooks look more realistic and three-dimensional. As I'm sitting here painting, I'm trying not to paint grass, but instead paint this large organic shape filled up with greens, yellows, and reds. I'm just about finished with this layer of color. While I'm finishing up, I'm also keeping in the back of my head, this will not be a completed painting. Instead, an impressionistic view of the landscape. All of the details won't be put in today, but instead, I'm trying to capture the essence of this place. Just like yesterday's painting, I'm going to take it back to the studio and finish putting in some detail work. I believe what makes a painting pop is when the darks are put in. I squint my eyes to determine the values of the scene. Where I see the darker values, I start to layer in more paint. but using much more pigment and less water on the paper and the brush. I've been painting in watercolor for a good 20 plus years. I have to admit, I'm still having my hesitations when I lay down highly pigmented darks on the paper, because with watercolor, you can't paint over it if it's too much. We also have to keep in mind that watercolor dries lighter, so even though it looks dark when you initially put it down, it will eventually get lighter. I noticed where the path starts by the building, it was too wide for it to be in the distance. For the perspective to be right, it needed to be narrower. So I loaded up my brush and filled in the area with some more greens and yellows and some clean water to blend it in. As I mentioned before, I don't want to put in a lot of detail, just hints of detail. I do want to provide hints these are trees, so I lay in some middle value tree trunks. In terms of values, when you paint a wooded area, it will be darker at the bottom than up in the trees. The trees catch the light and the area below becomes encapsulated with shadows. To show this, I take a mixture of my burnt umber and some of my cerulean blue to create a dark value and start to lay it in at the base of the trees. Another thing that this does is provide a dark area behind the light of the building, helping it stand out. To soften the edge and make it look like it fades into the trees, I take some clean water and soften the edge. I've spoke on this topic before, but one of the lessons that my instructor instilled upon me in college was that you shouldn't use blacks in painting. The reason, he said, was it made it look like a comic rather than a painting. Now, to each their own. I've seen beautiful paintings and the artist did use black. I choose not to in my watercolor paintings. Instead, I use a brown and a blue to create my darks. That's just my style. As the 2-hour window closes of me painting, there's one more hint of detail I want to put in. It's the indication of the tops of these trees. Now once again, I'm not worried about painting leaves. I'm going to paint these green blobs. Okay, instead of blobs, let's call them dots of varying sizes. That sounds better. These are my indicators of clumps of leaves at the tops of the trees. There's not really a rhyme or reason of where I put them, as long as they're not too close together, closing off the shapes that I'm going for. I do want to vary the sizes though, doing some small ones, mediums, and some larger ones. I also don't want to put them all in a straight line. Instead, I go up in the sky, back down towards the trees, and kind of smear it as I go along. That kind of gives some hints of branches along the way. My 2-hour window closes off and I'm satisfied with what I've completed. One last step to do before I head out, which is to take some reference photos to use while I'm back in the studio. I didn't know it, but while I was painting, a fellow artist was also creating a work of his own behind me, in which he gifted to me afterwards. By the way, he did come up to me before this video, and we had a great conversation. So I think I'm finished for today. I got most of the composition laid out, and I got some of the darks and the valleys that I want, so it's time to pack up and head back home. I'll probably put in a little more detail in the studio, but we'll see. But that's it for day 2.